I'm Rabbi Micah Streifer, and I'm the director of Laasok. I'm really excited to welcome all of you and to welcome many of you back as we kick off this year's Social Justice in Our Texts series. Laasok is a liberal Beit Midrash, a liberal house of study, where we come together to engage with our sacred texts and with each other, approaching Judaism through inclusive and progressive Jewish eyes, and where we make meaning for today in conversation with one another and with our sacred texts. This series on social justice in Jewish texts is an expression of that mission. Starting today and through June, we're going to meet once a month to explore what Jewish tradition teaches us about building a better and more just world around us. Today's topic is human rights, Jewish roots. And in a moment, I'll introduce our teacher for today, Rabbi Gabriel Kanter-Webber. But before we do that, let me acknowledge and thank the various partner organizations and congregations that are part of sponsoring or promoting this program. I'm going to name them all because it's an incredible coalition. A Wider Bridge, AMMUD, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, the CCAR Press and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, Central Synagogue, Congregation B'nai Israel in Little Rock, Arkansas, Congregation Shaarey Zedek in East Lansing, Michigan, Congregation Shir Chadash of the Hudson Valley, Keshet, the Kirva Institute, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and the Union for Reform Judaism, Temple B'nai Or in Morristown, New Jersey, Temple Judea in Coral Gables, Florida, Temple Shalom in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, and Zedek Box. This is an incredible coalition of Jewish social justice organizations, umbrella organizations, and congregations, and we're grateful and proud to be partnering with all of them. I also want to express thanks to all of those who donated to make this series possible, whether you made a donation when you were signing up or whether you did so at the website. Thank you for helping sponsor and helping support inclusive, progressive Jewish learning. And if you would like to make a donation toward this series or toward Laasok in general, I'm just going to drop a page in the chat. You can visit that page and do so. My last plug, and then we'll get down to the learning. Laasok has some really incredible learning opportunities coming up this fall, including new weekly study groups and ongoing weekly study groups on Midrash, Torah, Talmud, Pirkei Avot, our new study group on queering the weekly Parsha, which is Parsha from an LGBTQ plus perspective. We also have our Reclaiming Shabbat community of practice, our Sacred Story community for those who want to try their hand at writing Midrash. If you are interested in exploring further study options, just drop me a note in the chat privately or however you'd like. I'm just going to say hi in the chat so you can find me easily, and we'll find a time to talk. I'd love to talk with you about learning opportunities. Now, without any further ado, let me introduce Rabbi Gabriel Kanter-Webber, who is here to teach us today on human rights, Jewish roots. Rabbi Gabriel Kanter-Webber has been at Brighton and Hove Progressive Synagogue on the south coast of England since his ordination in 2022. He has a special interest in connecting Jewish teachings to contemporary events and social justice issues. Well, that's just perfect for today, isn't it? And is passionate about enabling people to weave Judaism subtly but strongly into their everyday lives. I'm going to invite us to join in the blessing for study, and then we'll turn things over to Rabbi Gabriel. Please join me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thanks to those who unmuted and joined me in the blessing and those who were saying it to yourselves. And this means in Hebrew, blessed is the eternal one whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness into our lives and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. Rabbi Gabriel, take it away, please.
Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone for joining, spending in most cases your afternoon learning, those of you who are in England, your evening. And tonight we're going to be looking at a subject which is very close to my heart, which is human rights and the way we connect to them as Jews. In the UK, and I know this is not unique to the UK, we have a really toxic discourse around human rights. By way of one example, earlier in this month, GB News, which is roughly equivalent to Fox News in terms of its placement, aired a piece revealing and expose the absolute scandal that our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, once wrote a textbook on human rights. And of course, Keir Starmer, who was famously a human rights lawyer before he became Prime Minister, it's maybe not that surprising that he was interested in that area. But the portrayal of something, of human rights as something which is a threat, which is there to make criminals comfortable and not for ordinary, nice people like us, is a narrative that's there very prevalent. And so what I did as a rabbi who's somewhat keen on human rights was set out to go article by article through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is that foundational human rights text, and to find a Jewish text which I felt more or less expressed the same idea, or from which we could say that Judaism could derive the same right. And that's what we're going to look at this evening, or this afternoon. We're going to go through the articles. We're going to see what I've chosen. But crucially, I want you to be feeling really free, first of all, to pop up in the chat and say whatever you want, but also put your Zoom hand up and interrupt with your Zoom hand at any point, because one of the challenges of finding Jewish texts to support every human right is Judaism is not always the best source for human rights. There are big areas of what we now regard as universal human rights that certainly it's very easy to find Jewish texts saying the exact opposite, and may be difficult to find ones on the same theme. So tell me when you think I've overreached myself. Tell me when you can think of something better. I'm sure that with, how many have we got? 52 people. 52 people, 28 articles. I'm sure someone will come up with a better suggestion or thought. And so we're going to begin. I'm going to screen share, which is hopefully going to display for you what I'm looking for. That is not quite what I was hoping for. Let's try again. There we go. It worked. So, Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the kind of setting the theme, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Brotherhood, possibly an outdated 1950s word, but we will allow them that. The text that I have found, which I think expresses this very universal theme, is from Masachet Sanhedrin in the Talmud. And it is this fantastic story of two brothers who were twins and lived in the same city. One was appointed king, while the other went out to engage in banditry. The king commanded that his brother be hanged. Everyone who saw the bandit hanging would say, "The king has been hanged." The king therefore commanded that his brother be taken down. There you go. Rabbi Mika has been looking at this text already this week. And what is remarkable about this text, of course, is it really undermines the argument that human rights are only there to protect criminals. And how does it undermine it? It's saying, of course, human rights are there to protect criminals. Everyone is entitled to be treated with a minimal level of dignity, including the criminals. And why do we do that? It's because everyone is, according to the analogy that we have here, created in the image not just of the king, but of God. Amy has a hand up. Please, Amy.
Was very much thinking like that. Genesis 1:27. Humankind was created in God's image. Be who you are, no matter anything. Shit, you're like that due to divine intervention. It's not necessarily linked to any personal decision making of yours.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And like it was tempting just to put Genesis 1:27 as the text for this, but I thought I'd go something slightly more esoteric. But you're absolutely right. This idea that everyone is created in the divine image, and therefore everyone, no matter what they do, who they are, what their characteristics, sexuality, gender, but crucially, what decisions they make in their life, what deeds they do, there's still an absolute minimum level beyond which we don't go. And why don't we go beyond it? Because going beyond it is tantamount to treating God in the way that you are treating that person. That one, as I said, is therefore relatively easy to find some level of Jewish basis for. The next one is the non-discrimination article, which again, you kind of would hope. Oh, sorry, Mika, you have a hand up, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the reason, see since I was studying this last week, the larger context of this has to do with the body of a person who's been executed not being left up, right? You have to bury a person, even a person who has been executed for a crime, even sort of like the person that you're most likely to dehumanize in society is still an expression of the image of God. So it occurs to me that, this idea of universal human rights really in some ways is born here in this idea that like we're not nice to people because we like them. We're nice to people because we believe in this basic concept that all people are expressions of God, even whether you like them or not, whether you agree with them or not, whether they're close to you or not.
That's absolutely right. And moreover, we only need to be told that there are human rights for people who our natural inclination would otherwise maybe not treat with human rights. So we don't need to be told to be, broadly speaking, nice to members of our family, because of course we'll be broadly speaking nice to members of our family, generalizing somewhat. We need to be told to treat people who we might otherwise have an instinctive yuck factor to say, wait a minute, question your yuck factor. We need to be told to treat nicely people who are criminals, whose moral actions revolt us in some way, because, wait a minute, there's still some level of humanity too. And that brings us really nicely, actually, onto our next right, which is the non-discrimination right. So the UDHR says that everyone is entitled to all of these rights, regardless of race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. I dread to think what debate there would be if this was being rewritten today when it comes to gender issues, but of course we in this space will understand gender to be included on that list on a moral level. The text I've selected here is about the story of Joshua and the Gibeonites. And it's a Midrash from Numbers Rabbah. In the original story, the Gibeonites come to Joshua and say, come and help us to win in a particular battle. And Joshua is somewhat reluctant. You can read the original in the book of Joshua, but the Midrash is really quite remarkable. So they come to Joshua, come to us quickly, help us and save us. Joshua thought at first, shall we trouble our community for the sake of these aliens? However, the Holy One ever to be blessed said to him, Joshua, if you estrange those that are distant, you will ultimately estrange those who are near. Go look at the roots from which you yourself have sprung. Are you not descended from aliens? For we are told that Joshua was descended from Joseph, who married the daughter of an Egyptian priest. And we've got two really important principles there in that passage from God's mouth, but obviously from a human author in a midrash. The first one is, go look at the roots from which you yourself have sprung. In other words, it could be us. It so happens that when we are the people considering whether we're keen on human rights, that's because we're in a position of privilege. But any slight accident of fate and any slight change to the social order could result in those of us who are privileged suddenly not being privileged, suddenly losing that privilege. And it could easily be us. But also we have this idea, if you estrange those that are distant, you'll ultimately estrange those who are near. In other words, if you accustom yourself to acting cruelly and callously, even in cases that we think might be deserving cases, once you let that that attitude into your soul, you're going to end up applying it more widely. Once we start saying, oh, well, these particular refugees are not worthy of our consideration, we're then going to start saying, oh, well, these particular citizens of our country of foreign origin are not worthy of our consideration. And eventually it will be everyone except me, and everyone identical to me is not worthy of our consideration. Next, and this is one that I'm not going to detain us too strongly on because it's easy peasy. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Thou shalt not kill. I say it's easy peasy. I know there's a million nuances that we could unpack here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move us on to some of the slightly more intriguing ones. Number 4, slavery. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Now, finding Jewish texts against slavery is harder than it sounds. It's very easy to find Jewish texts against Jews being slaves. The Haggadah is full of them. But it's also very easy to find Jewish texts talking about exactly how Jews are allowed to have slaves and how we have to treat them. And okay, they say we have to treat our slaves reasonably well, but that's not anti-slavery, that is regulating slavery. But fortunately, we have this really remarkable passage from Malbim. Malbim was a 18th century commentator. I'm saying 18th century, I'm now questioning whether I mean 19th. Someone will tell me in the chat almost certainly. Relatively modern commentator in any event, who was living in Eastern Europe. And crucially, he was familiar with the transatlantic slave trade. So he was living in a time when it was widely known what the fate was of non-Jewish slaves. And he wrote this really remarkable passage. Know that, he said, where we say one is permitted to treat another as a slave, this only means that they will not be punished by the Bet Din. However, is it not certain that they will be severely punished in every generation according to the law of the land? There is a hint in Deuteronomy 24 of the slave trade which is known to bring slaves from the land of Ethiopia in the continent of Africa. Its cruel leaders lead the slaves a very long way, feeding them poor food, clothing them very badly, and keeping them under guard until eventually they are infected by extremely virulent diseases. So let's have a think about that passage. When the Torah says we're allowed to have slaves, it only means that we won't be punished by the Bet Din, but we will be severely punished in every generation according to the law of the land. This seems to be almost a text that is incorporating human rights norms, very, very early human rights norms, anti-slavery norms, into Jewish tradition, even though Malbim can't find a foothold for them. He's looking at this slave trade that's happening in his world. He's clearly deeply uncomfortable with it. He's obviously making mental comparisons to the story of the Hebrew slaves. He can't find anything in the Torah that says it's prohibited. So what does he do? He says, okay, the Torah is only allowing it because it's trusting nations, national structures, civil society to take action. And of course, this is all the more remarkable for a rabbi living in 19th century Eastern Europe, where Jews relying on the law of the land to enforce ethical norms is not something you would expect. But here he's saying slavery is clearly such a great evil that that's what we're going to do. We are going to submit ourselves to the law of the land because the law of the land is saying slavery is wrong. The Torah doesn't, but that's because the Torah knows we're going to live in societies that will frown on this. Jerry has a hand up, please.
So in a certain sense, it seems like Malbim is saying that, irrespective of what's in the Torah, we need to ignore the Torah because the Torah is not right. That's obviously an unusual position for a Jewish sage.
I think he wants to say that, is the sense I get. But as you say, because he is an Orthodox Jewish sage, he can't say that. And so I get the sense he's going almost as near to that as he dare, which is, not the Torah is wrong. The Torah has a bit of a gap in it, but it's okay that it's got a gap because the human race has filled that gap. And in a way, we might say that's ever so slightly cowardly because it might be good to say the Torah is wrong. On the other hand, that's a really fascinating and important idea, which is that actually human ingenuity can fill moral gaps in the Torah. And in a lot of ways, we might say the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an example of human ingenuity filling a gap in the Torah. The Torah doesn't have a Bill of Rights. I had to work relatively hard to put all of this together because the Jewish tradition doesn't have it all in one place. But human ingenuity, including Jewish people involved in drafting these international documents, has managed to fill that gap a little bit. Rabbi Mika, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about it a different way. I wonder if in addition to human ingenuity or as a different way of understanding it, is there a hint here of what we call natural law? That is, the Torah may not say it, but we know in our kishkas, we know because it's just universally true that this is wrong. And if we trust state, this is a period of time where like liberalism is slowly coming into governance over time. And are we trusting ultimately that states will ultimately embody natural law, meaning that we can believe that this is wrong, even if the Torah doesn't say it, and that the world will sort of come to understand that? I don't know if that's making sense.
Yeah, no, it really does make sense. And I think there's definitely a sense of that there. And obviously the classic example is there's nothing against cannibalism in the Torah, but we've all got this instinctive idea it's wrong. And for longer than slavery has been instinctively understood as wrong. We've all had that idea. And yeah, I think there could be something similar there. I'm going to take Herbert. Jerry, I'm afraid I'm not going to come back to you again just for time reasons for the moment, but no offense. Herbert, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, it says permitted to treat another person. It doesn't mean permitted to have a slave or anything like that. Maybe it's treating a person which will not be, if he treats a person like a slave, like he gave in the examples below in Ethiopia, the way they are treated, and we're not supposed to treat any people like that. He's giving that as an example of treating non-slaves as that. It says to permit it to treat another as a slave. So I don't know if that means that this talks about slavery in general, but it just talks about the way slaves are treated. I don't know.
So that's a really good observation. It is partly contextually, if we're looking at that verse in Deuteronomy, we are going to see that he's talking about the institution of slavery. We could also say, of course, that some of the principles he outlines later on apply beyond the concept of slavery. Beyond the concept of slavery, there are people who are not slaves but are still in poor food, eating poor food, clothed badly, virulent diseases.
Right,
Maybe
right.
it's an argument that he's extending to them as well. All right. Let us go on to Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. I kind of struggled a little bit with this, but I found, it's not a rare one, is the concept of the cities of refuge in the Book of Numbers. The idea that even if someone is in that suspect category, they are to be preserved from vigilante violence, from untrammeled, unrestrained conduct of others. There need to be safe places. There need to be some sort of limits. Again, this is a slightly tricky one because there are, of course, places in the Torah that quite explicitly endorse torture. The ritual of the sotah being an obvious example. That punishment in the Mishnah where they fill your belly up with grain and sort of make foie gras out of you being another example. But I've done as best I can there. Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. So this is about the idea, I guess we might say kind of consequential on there being no slavery, that everyone has legal personhood. No one is a non-person. And again, the suggestion that I've come up with for this one is that very well-known line in Deuteronomy, assemble the people, men, women, children, little ones, the stranger, every different category of society. You're right, it is from this week's Torah portion, actually. It's from my bar mitzvah portion, among other places. That one I thought fitted rather well in terms of understanding everyone who is part of any society, including those who aren't really part of it, the stranger who's there, no matter how temporarily they are included as well. Now we come on to an area where it is much easier to find Jewish texts because equality before the law is something that we do find quite heavily. All are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. And so this is not just having fair courts, but it's specifically about discrimination in the law. So not just courts that are generally speaking fair, not just courts where your dad's not the judge, but also courts where there's not going to be systematic discrimination against different categories. And this is a passage from Sifra, which is an early rabbinic commentary on the book of Deuteronomy, which is talking about the judge shall not favor the poor. And the reason for that commandment that the rabbis come up with is, do not say to yourself as the judge, they are poor and their rich opponent and I are both obliged to provide them with charity, so I will rule in their favor. And don't favor the rich. Don't say to yourself, they're wealthy and from a good family and I could not possibly shame them. Now, not favoring the rich is fairly self-explanatory as a concept. Not favoring the poor is kind of a little bit harder to sort of instinctively rationalize. We understand that even-handedness is important, but this is actually quite an interesting argument. Do not reason they're poor and their rich opponent and I are both obliged to provide them with charity. Why is that the reason that's given? I think it's not actually to do with the fairness of the judicial system. I think it's making a wider point, which is, if it's your job to give charity to the poor, give charity to the poor. Don't mess about in your workplace in sort of manipulating things to route someone else's money to the poor. It is your job to ensure that society is fair, and independently of that, it's your job to make sure that justice is fair. And I think in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's a subtext as well. There shouldn't be discrimination in equal protection of the law, but that's because there shouldn't be discrimination at all. We shouldn't be having to ensure that the courts aren't systematically unfair to black people or aren't systematically unfair to women, because there shouldn't be those systematic unfairnesses in society to begin with. And so I think there's a double-edged element going on there. Next one, we have slightly more broadly, all are equal. No, I've pasted the same one there because I'm very foolish. This article of the Universal Declaration is just saying that there shall be fair, unbiased courts. And the one I've selected there is one of the Noahide commandments, which the rabbis insisted applies to the whole of humanity. So in some ways, a very early Bill of Rights, which is saying the children of Noah were commanded to establish law courts. In other words, one of the basic necessities of any society is to have a legal system. Rabbi Mika has asked, how do you account for privilege? Possibly you account for privilege by having another hour's session on it on another occasion, but because it's such a huge topic. But it is something that is tremendously difficult. And again, I think going back to that passage with the Gibeonites, it is understanding that it comes down to a level of what we would call moral luck. People are born into situations that may or may not have privilege attached. And as Amy says, it'd be so nice if it wasn't something we had to consider. That is a dodge of the question because it is far too big, but it's a very good one as well. All right, number 9. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. In other words, there has to be due process, and particularly what comes under this is what we call the right to be heard. A decision shouldn't be taken for you until you've had the right to mount some sort of defense, give some sort of counter-argument, whatever it may be. And the text I've chosen here is a fantastic responsum from the Rema, who's better known for his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, but he also wrote an awful lot of responsa. And here is what he had to say. It is obviously not possible to judge a matter without hearing the case for the defense. And even if it were not obvious, we could learn it from the ways of the Eternal One, all of whose ways are just, pleasant, and peaceful. When judging Adam, God began by asking him, "Who told you that you were naked?" And similarly with Cain, God asked, "Where is Abel your brother?" This was so as to hear Adam and Cain's arguments, and it is all the more important for a human judge to take this step. That's a really great argument because he's pointed out the slight illogicality in those 2 Genesis stories of God asking these questions, to which God, being omniscient, surely knew the answer. Why did God ask these questions? Because it's just fair that Adam and Cain should have a chance to mount a defense, however bad it might be. In English law, there is a very, very famous line that often gets quoted, which says everyone involved in any sort of legal process is aware of unanswerable cases that just manage to be answered, of open and shut cases that manage to be left open. And so similarly, maybe there was something that someone could say there. And of course, if God needs to ask, all the more so, how much do we? Cheryl, please.
So several things come to mind here. One of them is the expression driving while black. Is it, situation of, you just happen to have dark skin and therefore you get pulled over more often. And then the situation we have now in the United States where you just happen to have a foreign look to you and therefore you get arrested and possibly sent investigated to see if you're a foreign or if you, even if you were born in this country, if you don't have the papers. But just because you looked like you might be someone who wasn't born in this country, they investigate you.
Absolutely. In one of my other roles, I do visits to an immigration detention centre at Gatwick Airport, which is very near to where I live. And what is really frightening for me is that people there have not been sent there by any sort of court. So I don't know how it works in the States. In a prison, everyone has been sent there by a court or a judge. in the immigration detention, it is simply the government or a government officer decides someone should go there. And that means they haven't had this opportunity that the Rema says they should have. They've not been able to give their case. They've not been able to say, I have mental health issues that means I will be completely destroyed by being in detention. They've not had a chance to say, my children are disabled, I need to be there to look after them. And yeah, these are really worrying breaches that we're seeing in our own society, and it's all the more frustrating when the Rema was able to work it out so many centuries ago. Amy, please.
Very much reminding me of so many articles I've seen in the paper about the effect that ICE agents are exerting inside USA.
Absolutely.
Don't seem to fit in, even if you are a 100% law-abiding citizen. I've had jobs for years. Doesn't matter. Don't look different. Disappear. We want to get you out as promptly as possible.
Absolutely. And of course, even for people who look the same as well. You know, this gentleman who has just been arrested in relation to some sort of shooting, which has been in the news over here, he still needs a trial, no matter how obvious anyone may be thinking it is, because that's how societies work. Let's go on to number 10. Everyone is entitled to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. We're still on the legal system here. I've chosen this rather sweet passage from Maimonides from the Mishnah Torah. There are two litigants, one wearing fine garments and the second wearing degrading garments. We tell the honourable party, either clothe your opponent like yourself until the end of your trial, or dress yourself like them. Then you will be equal. In other words, everyone needs to be treated equally, and sometimes that means making adjustments to the world. It doesn't just mean saying, I'm not biased. It means doing a little bit more than that. And particularly, I like the example of clothing because it's not just about the potential bias of the judge. It's not the judge's inclination to look out and say, he's dressed in rags, he must be a wrong 'un. But also there's a level of the person dressed in rags won't be able to give their best performance if they are feeling inferior. There's that phrase, dress for the job you want. Actually, someone who is feeling very inferior or marginalized is going to struggle in a way that someone who is feeling very confident and privileged is not. And so it's a particular passage that I'm fond of there. Next one. This is a favourite of mine. No one shall be held guilty of any penal offence on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offence at the time when it was committed. So this is a rule against retroactive law. In other words, if, for example, the Parliament of the United Kingdom decides to ban smoking, the fact that some people were smoking last week cannot be held against them because it wasn't illegal at the time that they did it. And the fantastic Midrash which tells this story is of an argument between Moses and God after the sin of the golden calf. Because, of course, the question is, was it a sin at the time they did it? Moses hadn't come down with the 10 Commandments yet, saying don't create a golden calf. And if they hadn't been told not to do it, was it really wrong? And so we have, Moses said to God, why are you vexed with the Israelites? Because they made an idol? Well, you never told them otherwise. To which God replied, did I not say in the second commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me? Moses, however, retorted, you did not command them. It was I whom you commanded. You did not say you plural shall not. It was therefore only me who was commanded. This being the case, should I make an idol, please blot me out of your book. First of all, fantastic sarcasm game from Moses there. He has my great admiration. But he also makes a very important point, which is until the law has been publicized, you can't punish people for breaking it. And again, this is, with respect to those of you in the States, these things we're seeing about people's social media posts meaning they won't get visas or whatever it might be, unless the rules are clear, unless it is you are not allowed to say this or you will lose your visa, it's not fair. It also might be fair if those are the rules and they're transparent if they're bad rules, but certainly not fair if there's no transparency. Herbert, I'm going to ask very quickly if you could.
As quickly it comes to mind punishing people for slavery, where slavery was permitted at that time. And there's that sort of issue comes up sometimes of paying reparations or things like that.
It's very complicated. And of course, paying reparations is not necessarily a punishment. Again, this is possibly a topic for an entire other course. Judaism has fascinating things to say about reparations as well. But yeah, these are all things about how morality changes over time, but crucially about law changing over time as well. And when law changes, no one should lose out from that, I think, is the principle we have. The next one is the one that I almost struggled with the most. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family home, or correspondence. I really struggle to find anything in Jewish texts about a proper right to privacy. I found stuff about modesty, which is not the same, of course. That's almost enforced privacy. So I'm really fascinated to hear what people can come up with. The best I came up with was from the Cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom, of which no sort of original exists, but it's quoted in various places. And he said, do not read a letter sent between two third parties without the recipient's knowledge and permission. That's kind of the best I could come up with. That's very obscure text, and I was surprised that I couldn't find anything better. So there are prizes out there for anyone who can improve on that. Now we're up to freedom of movement. Again, with all the very topical things. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including their own, and to return. And the passage I found for this is from a commentary of Rashi. Not from a commentary of Rashi, sorry, from a Talmudic commentary. But we need to look at the verse it's based on first. So the verse in Leviticus is, you are to proclaim freedom, doror, throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And the Talmud says, the Hebrew word doror means liberty. And Rabbi Yehuda clarifies, what is the meaning of doror? It's like one who dwells, medayar, in any dwelling, dayara, and moves merchandise around all countries. So he's using basically a series of fairly weak puns to make an important point, which is people can go anywhere they want. That's what freedom is. And when you're declaring freedom universally, it doesn't just mean freedom in one particular place, otherwise it's not freedom. If you're only free within certain boundaries, it's not freedom. Freedom means going anywhere you want. I'm not sure he would necessarily extend it to the concept of open borders that is a modern concept, but we kind of have the idea there. All right, next up, seeking asylum. Again, a bit topical. Everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And now we have this rather nice passage from the Ran, Rabbi Nissim Gerondi, who is a Spanish rabbi of the Middle Ages. When the people of a certain kingdom turned on them, they would move on to a different land, where they could serve the Eternal One as they desired, as in our present situation. For when enforced conversion began in the Arab lands, the Jews fled to a different land, and thence back to the Arab lands. And this gave us a lease of life in the midst of our afflictions and our toils. Now, first of all, that's a fascinating argument for there not being any sort of world government or superstructure. It's important that there are different societies because that means all our eggs aren't in one basket. It's a very diasporist passage in lots of ways. It's saying when Jews are spread out, at least some of them are likely to be somewhere safe at any single moment. But also, again, the idea that you're moving to a different land where we can serve the Eternal One. We're moving somewhere where we can be not just alive, but where we can do what we want. There's no suggestion here that people should remain in a country where they would be persecuted for doing something, but just not do it so they're not persecuted. No, countries should be taking in refugees, not just if there's literally no way they could remain alive in their home country, but if they can actually be themselves, be who they are, exercise these rights and flourish. Absolutely, Rabbi Mikra said it's like, let my people go that they may serve me. It is, there's more to life than being alive, I think is also the message, is almost the message that the Ran is giving us here. All right, 15. Slightly over halfway, but I think we can make it. Everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality. Difficult to find Jewish texts for just because of the historical context. But I've come up with the verses in Exodus where Moses is being told that he's an Israelite. Moses is learning his nationality and his heritage. And that was the closest I could get there. Again, a bit of a struggle. But there we go. Dawn, lovely to have had you here for a little bit. Article 16. This is one that I like the Jewish text because it is a It's got traces of humour in it, let's say. The right to marriage. Men and women of full age, again, same-sex marriage, 1950s. Let's just assume ourselves to be in a modern world now. Men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You've got the right to marry. We have this rather amusing Midrash from Genesis Rabbah. A Roman noblewoman took 1,000 of her manservants and 1,000 of her maidservants and stood them in 2 rows and ordered, "This one shall marry this one, and this one shall marry this one." She paired them all up that very evening. In the morning, they reported for duty. One had a cracked skull, one had a black eye, one had a broken leg. The noblewoman exclaimed, "What happened?" The servants all replied, "I don't want him," or "I don't want her." Again, if we leave the domestic violence to one side, we have a rather nice anecdote there about the importance of being able to choose their own life partners, the impossibility of having a life partner forced on you, but also the wrongness of being deprived of the opportunity to have a life partner of your choice. The problem for these maidservants and manservants who are being paired up is not just they didn't want each other, but they might have wanted someone else. They probably did. All right. The right to property, not stealing, thou shalt not steal, not a complicated one. Let's move on to more intriguing territory. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This includes the right to change your religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, to manifest your religion or belief. Now, finding Jewish texts on freedom of religion is a bit complicated for the same reason as the slavery issue. It's easy to find texts on why Jews should be allowed to practice our religion. It's harder to find texts on why other people should be allowed to practice their religions. And it's easy peasy to find texts on why we should burn people who do practice their own religions. What I've chosen is something that I have definitely taken out of context and against the will of the author, but tough luck, 'cause that's what I've done, which is this passage from the Book of Kings. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Eternal One all his days, as Jehoiada the priest had taught him, but the altars were not removed. People were still sacrificing and burning incense on the altars. Now, in context, Joash is being given a bit of a criticism here. King Joash did, generally speaking, what was good, but one failing on his part was he didn't remove the altars outside Jerusalem where people were practicing slightly different religious practices. I've decided, though, because those two verses are next to each other, because he's broadly speaking a good chap, and he allowed people to continue practicing the religion they wanted, that's kind of a bit of a hechsher.
I have no need to go.
That's where I've gone with that. There's also some very interesting modern responsa about the role of freedom of religion in the state of Israel. A lot of the biblical laws about, for example, burning places of idolatrous worship only apply in the land of Israel. So for most of Jewish history, they haven't really been that significant. But of course, as of 1948, it did become an issue. And there's some really interesting ways that the Orthodox rabbinate reasoned itself out of having to burn churches and mosques down, which is positive, but also really interesting. We'll come on to those if we have time at the end, maybe. Freedom of expression, number 19. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. One could, of course, just like put the whole Talmud here as a classic example of everyone being allowed to say whatever they want and to argue for or against anything they want. The passage I've chosen, though, is from Numbers, the story of Eldad and Medad. They remained in the camp. The Spirit rested on them, and they ranted like prophets in the camp. A certain lad ran and told Moses, saying, "Eldad and Medad are ranting like prophets in the camp." And Joshua, Moses' attendant, said, "My lord Moses, restrain them." But Moses said, "Are you zealous for me? If only all the people of the Eternal One were prophets, that good would put the rush of divine spirit onto them." In other words, we want everyone to be saying as much as they can, because only if people say as much as they can have we got the maximum chance of capturing the ideas that are going to be beneficial and valuable for everyone. There's a subtext there as well, maybe, of people being allowed to kind of use freedom of expression for self-fulfillment as well, for self-development. Eldad and Medad have got this inside them. They need to get it out. They need to be able to say it. Freedom of assembly and demonstration. This one, there was nowhere I could go but to this fantastic passage in the book of Samuel. Samuel grew old. He set his sons up as judges of Israel. But his sons did not go in his ways, and they were bent on gain and took bribes and twisted justice. And all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, Look, you yourself have grown old, and your sons have not gone in your ways, so now set over us a king to rule us like all the nations. They had a gathering, and they told their government they were not happy about the way things were going. It was a protest against corruption, possibly the first recorded protest against corruption. And, as we will know if you've read on in the story, Samuel eventually did it. He said, yeah, fair play, have a king. Don't think it's a good idea myself, but if that's what you as the people want, you as the people get it. So we've even got a little echo of democracy happening there as well. Of course, it did turn out to be a terribly bad idea, but democracy does mean that sometimes we have to do terribly bad ideas. I'm not going to mention Brexit because it won't have the same emotional resonance for many of you that it does here. I see the person in York is doing a grin because it does have emotional resonance there. But this is what happens. Peaceful assembly is peaceful assembly. All right, now we come to democracy itself. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. Everyone has the right of equal access to public service. The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures. The nearest we get in Jewish texts, as far as I could find, is this passage from the Rema again, who says, any issue on which the community cannot be unanimous, all of the householders must be sat down, and they must agree to cast their vote with a pure heart, and they follow the majority. Should the minority refuse to cooperate, the majority have the right to compel them, and if anybody declines to vote, their opinion is not taken into account, and the decision is taken by the majority of those who do vote. We have a lot of the points from the human rights article being represented here. We have the fact that voting takes place at all. We have the fact that it works by majority. We have the fact that people who choose not to vote give up their right to vote. They don't have any sort of absentee veto. This is not talking about absentee voting. They don't have any sort of veto, people who actively decide not to take part. And this idea of voting with a pure heart, I like to think is similar to the idea that there should be genuine elections as well. These are not elections where Robert Mugabe has stuffed all the ballot boxes in advance. These are not elections where there is bribery. These are elections where everyone has a real opportunity to express their own personal view. The difficulty here is the householders. All of the householders must be sat down, and who, of course, were the householders at the time? They would have been the men, and probably the rich men as well. You can't have everything in these Jewish texts, I think, is the lesson there. But what we might also say, if we wanted to be apologists for this text, is the householders are the ones who have the concern. These would probably have been votes on financial matters, on matters of tax. The householders would be the ones paying tax. So maybe there's a point there that only people who are affected by a decision should be able to vote on it as well. Again, this is one where I'm possibly overreaching, but these are the difficulties. All right, social security. Everyone as a member of society has the right to social security and is entitled to its realization of the economic, social and cultural rights indispensable for dignity and the free development of their personality. This one, I'm particularly keen on a comment of Rashi. Rashi is commenting on that very well-known verse, you shall not mistreat any widow or orphan. And what's his comment? This is actually the law regarding any person at all. But the Torah speaks of what actually happens, and it highlights widows and orphans because they are vulnerable and commonly oppressed. This passage is the perfect answer to why don't white lives matter? This passage is the perfect answer to when is International Men's Day? The answer is we have these particular concerns in society because that's how society works. There are people in society who are particularly vulnerable or marginalized, and those are the ones we focus on. Obviously, Black Lives Matter doesn't mean you can go around slapping white people in the face for fun. And obviously, International Women's Day doesn't mean you can go around knifing men in the kidneys for fun. And obviously, in the Torah, you shall not mistreat any widow or orphan doesn't mean you can go around mistreating men for the joy of it. What it does mean is we have to turn our eyes particularly to situations that we know involve levels of vulnerability. This is an early recognition of privilege, or of lack of privilege in lots of ways. Next up, I'm going to speed through this one because it's a simple one. Everyone has the right to work and to be paid for their work. We have that verse in Leviticus, you do not keep overnight the wages of a labourer. That was a simple one to find. Everyone has the right to rest. We have the commandment of Shabbat. And crucially, in the commandment of Shabbat, it applies not just to us, but to our children, our servants, our maidservants, the sojourners, the guests, the animals, the fact that the right to rest is universal. We're having universality here. Jerry has asked a very important question, which I'm going to come back to at the end. It does seem that I'm stretching in many situations. The short answer is you're right, but I'm going to come back to it in more detail in a little bit. Here we go. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being. Here we have a rather marvelous passage from the Shulchan Aruch, which is saying, the Torah gives the doctor permission to heal, and it's a mitzvah included in the commandment to save life. So a doctor who refuses to heal, behold, they are like one who sheds blood, even if the reason is that there is someone else present able to step in. One who has medicine which their sick neighbor requires, it is forbidden for them to exploit the situation as a profiteer. I realize this is probably going to be more redolent to those in the States than to those in the UK. Now we're talking about healthcare profits. Moreover, even if the patient agrees to pay an extortionate price, perhaps if their situation is desperate and the seller has a monopoly, they are not bound by such an agreement and only need pay an appropriate amount. Fantastic recognition of the fact that people will agree to anything if they're desperate for medicine. Of course they will. And that doesn't make it fair or right, and possibly all the more morally staining on the person who is taking advantage of the situation. Next, I know I'm speeding through because I'm looking at the time and I want to leave us a little bit of time at the end as well. Everyone has the right to education. And then in the Tosefta, we have this line, Rabbi Yehuda says, anyone who does not teach their child a trade teaches them banditry. In other words, why is it important that we educate people? Not just because it's good to let the individual learn and develop and flourish, but it's good for society as well. When people are educated, when people can access education, everyone in society benefits. Crime goes down, prosperity goes up, happiness goes up. What's not to like about education? I don't need to say that to all of you who are here doing some free education. Everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. This is where I completely fell down finding anything particularly on point in the classical texts. Rabbi Ruth Adar, who might even be here, is the sort of person who might be, I imagine, has done this passage. Ruth Adar is your classmate. I knew we'd be 2 degrees of separation. Has this passage about the importance of enculturating Jewish children in Jewish culture, not just about sitting them down to learn it, but about them having the opportunity to experience it, soak it up, to know that that's what their parents are doing. And again, the same goes for everyone else in society. Culture is what educates children as much as formal education does. Very quickly, everyone has the right to a social and international order in which these rights are upheld. Rabbi John D. Rayner, who is a liberal rabbi in the UK, or was a liberal rabbi in the UK, a very foundational liberal rabbi, has said that Judaism, again, has kind of got this gap in how the law goes. Like other ethical codes, we're primarily concerned with relations between individuals rather than collectivities. But it's clear, he says, that the same moral principles which apply to personal relations should also govern international relations. It has to be admitted that the full implications of that principle have not yet been worked out in Judaism. To that extent, its teachings need to be supplemented by the more recently created instruments of international law, such as the various United Nations declarations and conventions, themselves largely influenced by Hebrew values. So this is a semi-answer to the point that you raised, Jerry, which is this is all a bit of a stretch and a twist. You are right, but also, Rabbi John Rayner suggests, we should be treating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as part of halakha, almost. There's a bit of a gap in halakha, and we're not just supplementing it with human ingenuity, like we said with the slavery. We should be incorporating this into our halakha. Because the Torah doesn't go into international relations, of course it doesn't, we can do that for ourselves, and we can treat these things inspired by Torah values as encompassing them in itself. All right, 2 more. We could do this in a minute and a half. It's all right, we'll go 2 minutes over if we need to. Everyone has duties to the community in which the free and full development of his personality is possible. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law for the purposes of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others. So this is the kind of meta-human right, which says sometimes human rights have to be limited. So the classic example is the shouting fire in a crowded theatre. That is not included in the right to free speech. People in prison can't necessarily complain about the breach of the right to liberty. The concept of prison is not itself intrinsically problematic. And to illustrate that, we have a fantastic responsum from the Rashba, who says, even though this so-called regulation that he was dealing with was enacted by those who legitimately administer the community, they may only make rules that improve things, not rules that make things worse. They have no power to breach the fences of the Torah. In other words, there are limits. It's fine for there to be laws. Laws always limit our rights, and that's entirely proper and sensible. But there's a limit to those laws as well. It has to actually make things better. It has to harm people's rights to the minimum level. And finally, we have one of the most important rights. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for anyone any rights to engage in any activity aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms set forth. So this is what's often called an abuse of rights doctrine. It means that the Nazi Party can't claim freedom of speech, because if they're using freedom of speech to harm other people's freedom, then that's not valid. Plenty of other examples of that as well. And of course, the best way of illustrating that point is this wicked person who wishes to adopt the leniencies of Beit Shammai and the leniencies of Beit Hillel. You can't have it both ways. Human rights are there to make things better for humans, not to make them worse. Whew. That was a very whistle-stop tour through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Jewish text. I was as honest as I could be about when I struggled, and I'm now being completely honest that sometimes, you're right, it's a bit of a reach. I've had to take the odd thing out of context, I've had to stretch the odd point, and that I think is an illustration of just how far Jewish thinking has come on, and how varied it is. Some of these rights are foundationally encapsulated in the Torah, some of them came along a couple of centuries later, and some of them are just modern discoveries. Suddenly humanity realised slavery is wrong. Suddenly humanity realised we need universal rights that defend everyone. And Judaism is able to adapt to these, but in doing that, it can look back to some of the early mistakes, but also some of the early successes in developing those rights. So thank you all so much for joining. I've really enjoyed teaching and learning with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your course, of which there is an advert in the chat.
Thank you to Rabbi Gabriel. One of the ideas that's really central to the way we approach texts at Laasok is that we think of ourselves as being in conversation with the texts. So I think as you're bringing these ancient texts and modern texts to be in conversation with each other, that this is such an incredible way to kick off this series, which is about human rights and social justice. And I mean, I can't believe you made it through all 30 articles. Wow, this like whistle stop tour through these articles. And for those of you who are here in the room, I did post in the chat Rabbi Gabriel's PDF, so you can go back and reread it, because I think we could all spend many hours with it. But we will now spend the rest of the year breaking down some of these ideas, looking at them more deeply, spending more time with this question of how does Judaism underpin our approach to social justice. Judaism doesn't always get it right, and yet Judaism has a whole lot to teach us for how to build a better world today. So thank you to Rabbi Gabriel Kanter-Webber. Thank you to all of our partners that I mentioned earlier. Thank you to all of you for being here. This session will be put onto the Laasok YouTube page, which I'm going to drop into the chat now, and you're also going to get an email with that link in the next day or so. And if you are interested in making a donation to Laasok to support progressive Jewish learning, you can do so at the link that I've just put into the chat. Our next session is October 20th with Rabbi Barbara Simons on prophetic voices then and now, thinking about the prophet as a voice of social justice in society. I look forward to seeing many of you there, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Have a good week. Thanks.